Hey
Hey,
Chris, how's it going?
good, good. How you been?
I've been good, thanks. So, welcome everyone to the second Meet the Clinician, and I'm really happy to have Chris here. And we're going to be talking today about men and mental health and how to change the narrative of how men talk about difficulties.
I'm a licensed therapist, and so I've been working as a therapist for the past, I'd say the past 7 years. And so within working within that framework, I've done a lot of work with Black males, and so from the age of 5 to adulthood. And so with that being said, it's been very more impactful because of representation and because it's not a lot of us out there doing what we do. That's why I've kind of taken my position more seriously. So anytime there's a conversation surrounding, Black men and how, we deal with vulnerability and, like toxic masculinity, like I'm all for that. It's always something that I'm, open to. So.
Just to give a bit of context as to why we decided to do this and why I reached out to Chris was a couple of weeks ago. I was on a panel, and one of the questions that was asked was around the gender gap. Someone said, when you look at common mental health difficulties like depression or anxiety, you see that women is higher for women than men. And the question was, why is that? Is it because men are less likely to experience distress and mental health difficulties? Why is there that gender gap? And that led to a lot of really interesting conversations that day, and it got me thinking about that. And I thought, this is definitely a topic to talk about on Side Tips. And so I did reach out to you, and we had a great conversation. My first question then to you, Chris, is, this term toxic masculinity is one that is everywhere in popular culture, and is one that people often go to when they try to explain perhaps why men are less likely to recognize when they're in distress, or to play it down when they're in distress, and less likely to seek help when they're in distress. So what is your take on this idea of toxic masculinity, and what is toxic masculinity?
Okay. So it's real. I think toxic masculinity was real popular, I think probably about 3, 4 years ago. And then it started taking a turn because it was a new term. It started taking a new turn where people started seeing it more as, a controversial word. And so, in my opinion, I think that when you say toxic masculinity, sometimes it actually represents masculinity being toxic. And
Mm,
so, I take it as more so that, masculinity in and of itself is basically kind of this wide spectrum in which us as men, navigate, relationships and our emotions and our feelings and all of these things, comprise together. But then within that spectrum, you also find some of those unhealthy behaviors that that we engage in. And so then I actually prefer the term man box because that's a new term that came out a couple years ago. And in my research, I looked at it as something that was more beneficial in terms of, expressing or discussing how, you know, um, uh, the unhealthy behaviors that men have sometimes. And so with the man box, it's something that has been impactful even in my own practice with some of my male clients. And so the man box is really those gender roles that have been assigned to men,
mm,
uh, where basically you are, you have to function within a specific construct, and you have to act a certain way as a man, or you have to do certain things as a man.
mm,
So and this is one of my favorite things to do as far as like props. So like you look at a box like this, and
mm,
so this box basically represents that man box. And every box has a lid, right? And it has the four corners and it's all enclosed. And so with a man box, really it's like we have all these things that we can, do, and the things that we can do. So for example, you have to be strong, you have to be resilient. Don't ask for
mm,
help. All of that is all up inside this box. project, be aggressive, instead of showing emotion,
Mm.
suppress your emotions, this is how you should treat women. All of that is within this box. And the problem is when you're trying to take things outside of that box, it becomes challenging because you have all these influences. For us as men, the women that we're with influence us, the jobs that we, go to influence us, our parents, all these, our support systems, they all influence how we put ourselves within this box. And so you can't get out of the confines of a box. What happens? You're suppressed, you're suffocated on the inside, but then when you're able to lift that box and you're able to get outside of that box, what happens is that you do meet a lot of resistance, because men who get outside of the box are basically saying that I am not restricting myself to responding in a certain way, or I am, I'm deciding that it's okay for me to be emotional. It's okay for me to, put on my truest self without any kind of judgment. But what makes it challenging for a lot of men to get out of that box is the fact that you also have other men who police each other, and so we terms of how we react to certain things. So we basically, put each other down and say, well, you shouldn't be talking like that, or, you're gay for, acting a certain way or doing a certain thing. You also have that even in relationships where sometimes women, will kind of push this agenda that, no, you should be making this type of money. And so if you don't do that, then you're not, you're not a man. I'm making more money than whatever. So those are the challenges of, getting outside of that framework, getting outside of, that box. You also think about it like in regards to COVID, you look at the mask, and what does the mask represent? You're protecting yourself, right? You're making sure that when you step outside, that you're being protected. And a lot of times we as men, we carry that mask, that invisible mask, which basically says that I don't want to, express myself. I don't want to talk about certain things. So I'm keeping all of that inside. When you look at social distancing while you wear a mask, that almost represents how we as men almost distance ourselves from, talking about certain things that we need to talk about, being vulnerable, being in a space where we can, we can be free to be ourselves without any kind of judgment. And so when you're in that, in that man box where you feel like, okay, well, performing domestic duties at home is something that only women should do, or as he said, well, I shouldn't be doing the laundry. That's the woman's job, to do. That is all within that framework of the man box that society, that media has, put out for, for us. And so that would be more so those unhealthy, behavior patterns instead of, toxic masculinity. So.
Yeah, but you've made a lot of really interesting points there. One around the idea that masculinity in and of itself is not toxic, but it's on a spectrum. But for each man, there is often a man box, a box which they define themselves as, but also that society defines them as. And I think it was interesting that you said a lot of times, even the people around us, the relationships that men are in, their jobs, all of this as well can sometimes reinforce keeping men in this man box. And this man box is how you feel you need to act and you need to be in order to be a man. So anything that is outside of the man box almost feels like a threat to your masculinity or your manhood.
Absolutely. Always on guard, you're always on guard, always like, okay, what do I need to do to prove my masculinity in this situation? Would I be looked at as something? So there's a lot of work that goes on the end, in your mind, where you're like really nitpicking and trying to make sure that you're not, the opposite of what I guess society expects.
Yeah, and I think somebody else just commented on something that you said as well, which is some of these pressures are also coming from other men as well, men policing men in terms of how to be a man or what is defined as being a man. And I think what you talked when you talked about the mask, I think what really struck me about that is that sense of men feeling like they need to protect this image of themselves at all times, which is really interesting. So kind of taking that one step further, because you've talked about how a lot of the blockers to men expressing when they're distressed or men seeking help comes to these gender norms and that we assign to one another. How do these gender norms then kind of influence the way that boys are raised and the men they then grow up to become?
Well, I mean, you look at research, and when I was doing, some research, even, outside of, preparing for this, but just doing research and working with the clients that I work with, I realized that our culture and environment influences the way boys are being brought up. So a lot of times the way we raise our boys is based off of what was modeled, before us. How our fathers managed fatherhood and what masculinity represented. So then you look at how raising a girl is different from raising a boy. A girl would be, if a girl was taking risks, it's more conversational. It's more, okay, take your time, don't, you're giving her all these tools, to work with. With the boy, it's mean like, okay, go out and do it, go and figure it out, go figure yourself out, and so, you want to create that form of independence, with, an autonomy within the child, within the boy. But then there's also the damaging effects that come with it. A lot of times the way we raise boys informs them that when they ask for help, it's a sign of weakness. So then how does that reflect in the classroom? When they're in the classroom and they don't understand something, it's easy to internalize that. It's easy to say, I don't understand, but I'm not going to express it because I don't want to be that form of weakness. You even look at when boys start getting through that manhood stage, when they're, teenagers, and then they're going through puberty, there's that whole notion of, okay, go ahead and start having sex, go and have your sexual conquest. Instead of those boys to be taught how to explore their sexuality, explore, their bodies as it changes, they're not really given that time, or no one is really putting that out there, to say, hey, this is how you should navigate, manhood as you get older. You even look at some of the vocabulary that we use for boys, when we raise them. Everything has a lot to do with winning. Everything has to do with success. Okay, you have to win that football game. You have to win that soccer game. Like, instead of just saying, just have fun with it, enjoy. The winning part is the icing on the cake, and this whole trying to create that balance of making our boys more competitive, but then also having them in a position where they don't feel that stress that comes in early on and reflects itself as they get older, and so I think for me, in the work that I do, the goal is to kind of reconstruct that model of masculinity, where I kind of give give boys a variety of options in terms of how they can express themselves. It's not only just this one way of expressing yourself as a boy. Like, you have these other ways that you can express yourself. You can cry, and you can feel sad about something happening. You don't have to, because a lot of times, you also hear from women where it's like, oh, you're being too overly emotional. It's too much. Like, you don't need to be doing all of that. Like, that's what we as women, we as women, do. But then I think it's also redefining what strength is. That strength, is not, just physical strength. That I'm strong when I show vulnerability. I'm strong and I'm empathetic. I'm strong and I'm showing love, to somebody, even if they're not showing it back to me. I'm not weak just because, or I'm not being too nice just because I smile at a stranger that I pass by. Like, I don't always have to have this front of aggression, so yeah. So I think that's a huge part. And then also teaching our boys how to be accountable. When boys learn how to be accountable for their actions, then what happens is that as they get older, they have no form of accountability. So then they get into relationships, they get into the workplace, and they don't feel like they should take responsibility for some of their actions. And you don't have a lot of boys who talk about, apologizing, or, saying, hey, you know what, I was wrong for what I did, or, talking to their friends, even like, yo, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that. Like, there's just no accountability that, boys get to have.
Yeah, you've said a lot of really important things there. I think one of the first things you said that really struck me was how, in an attempt to make boys independent, we're unintentionally sending a message that asking for help is weakness.
Yeah.
And so boys will then tend to internalize when they're struggling because they don't want to appear as being weak or not independent or self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And I thought that was, quite interesting. And you've made a lot of really important points there as well, in terms of, again, how even the language that we use with boys,
Yes.
they internalize that, a lot about winning and competition. And so that's really interesting. And talking about accountability, talking about responsibility, and how boys will take this on with them, and then use this when they're men in terms of how they relate with others. And I think something else that you said, which I thought was so important when you talked about expressing sexuality, is this idea that with women, there's a tendency to be more nurturing and really explore those things with them, explore their sexuality. You know, women are a lot more guarded, especially when they're teenagers, with sex and boys. But, you know, with boys, it's like boys will be boys, let boys explore, let boys do what they need to do.
Yeah.
But what messages are we kind of leaving boys and men when we say those things, and we don't kind of give that same attention to them in terms of supporting them with exploring their body, their minds.
Yeah.
So a lot of quite interesting things you've said there.
And you know, like what you just said about, like, you know, giving them that option to kind of explore their bodies, is if a boy's not able to explore his own body, how is he going to be able to do that when he is, you know, having sex with a woman? There's more disrespect, you know, for women. There's more of looking at women as, you know, objectifying women in terms of sexuality. And then that's what you see, you know, as a woman. So then the intimacy is taken out of that, you know, context. It's more so of, this is just a sexual conquest that that I'm trying to have, you know, and then you have all the consequences that come, you know, with that, you know, whether it's, herpes or whatever, like all these different things that, you know, come into play as a result of all these choices. But a lot of times when boys do all these things, or young men do these things, it's subconscious. They're not even aware that this is kind of where it was rooted in, you know. And everything has a root, you know, nothing just happens like that. Everything has a root, and a lot of the things that have been unaddressed, those are the things that kind of take form as, you know, it kind of cements the personality of the child.
Yeah, and I think something else you said that I thought was so important is that in your work in therapy, you give men, or you create spaces for men to express their emotions in different ways. Like, these are all the different ways you can express your emotions. And I think that really struck me, because sometimes that's lacking outside of therapy. That's lacking in the home, that's lacking in school, where boys can express their emotions. And often you see that boys have a limited range of how they express their emotions. They're either not expressing it at all, or they're expressing with aggression and anger. And those seem to be the only two acceptable ways for men to express their emotions.
Yes. Yeah. And you make a great point with that, because I realized that with even the boys that I work with, the young men that I work with, where coming into therapy, it's always, I'm mad, I'm sad. So then I got this emotional vocabulary dictionary, where I basically said, okay, before we start session, you know, I need you to look through the dictionary and figure out what you're feeling, and let's figure out. And then they're expanding their vocabulary as they go along, you know. But then I also think that it's that whole with you know, black males, is that we have these different spectrums in which we can express ourselves, you know. So for me, it's put more work on me, but beautiful work in terms of making sure that when I sign up a new client, that I'm making sure that therapy is customized to your personality. So I have some boys who basically, you know, therapy is more so, you know, for them, their personalities, they're more creative, or, you know, they have their, you know, emotions on their sleeves. But then you have other boys who they're basically, you know, other boys who they're, you know, more tough and they're more macho. And, you know, so you kind of work with that. And then their interests are so different. Some are more creative, some are more, you know, sports like, you know, and so you have to kind of nurture those abilities into and incorporate it into their therapy. And then you start to see more changes happen, because you realize that a one size does not fit all, you know, for young males. So
how do these like gender norms, especially for men now, you know, we've talked about emotions with boys and younger men, but how do these gender norms influence the way that men express emotions, if they do, and ask for help if they do?
right, that, you know, need to kind of hold things in, and to hold on to stuff. I remember even for women, you find that, especially a lot of black women, where they have to hold on all these, you know, emotions. I remember I had a mom who came into my office, and she had her handbag around her, you know, her shoulder the entire session. And I kept saying, you can let it, you know, you can drop it down. And she refused, you know. She was like, no, I need to hold my bag. And so for me, that was more of a metaphor of how a lot of times we hold on to all the weight, because we feel like if we drop it, we're out of control, you know. So to your question, like with men and emotions, you know, you look at the man box narrative, and what does the man box narrative say? It says that you're limited within the confines of this box, and this is only what you can do. And when you step out of there, there'll be consequences. People will laugh at you. You'll be looked at a certain type of way. And so what happens is that when men are stuck in that man box, the truth of the matter is that it's beneficial to some extent. It's beneficial because then you're getting all this praise and rewards from society, and everyone
Mm.
like, yo, you know, you're killing it, you know, you're doing a great job because you're doing everything that is what is, you know, I guess society's ideals or norms. But then what happens is that long term, you have men who are in the man box where they deal with depression, and they
Mm.
deal with anxiety, and they deal with, you know, feelings of not being up to par. And so then what does that translate into? Unhealthy behaviors. So you have drug abuse, you know, you have substance,
Mm.
you know, you have alcoholism, you have you know, you have all these things that happen. You know, you also have men who they start to turn in because of those societal norms. They start turning in even on their wives or their girlfriends, where there's a lot of physical and verbal abuse. You know,
Mm.
there's a lot of aggression, there's a lot of outbursts and meltdowns, you know, happen. I've seen that happen even with men, you know, that I've had in my office, where literally, like, it would just take something and then they just burst out in tears and just
Mm.
have a, and you realize that these are years of things that have been building up for so long, and just one thing in that moment triggered them to just break down. And
Mm.
part of that breakdown is such a healing tool, because what it does is that it puts you in a position to realize that I'm in a safe space. When I'm in therapy, I'm in a
Mm.
safe space to be able to be myself. And that's what I always say, is that when you're in that safe space, you can really be who you want without any
Mm.
kind of. And so what society represents on the outside is not what therapy represents when you walk into the office. It's a
Mm.
whole different dynamic in terms of how you're being, you know, how your emotions are even being handled. You
Mm.
know, I think that also our conversations with other men seem to be more surface level. So when men hang out with each other and, you know, we're just talking, most of the conversation is surface. You know, it's more like, oh, how you doing? You know, what is going on? You know, it's very surface. Everything is just more for laughs. But then we never really get deep into those
Mm.
questions, you know, like, what is going on with your family? What is going on with, you know, what are the challenges you're dealing with at work? You know, and we don't engage in those conversations with each other because it's awkward. You know,
Mm.
when someone expresses vulnerability, it's awkward, and we don't know how to react, and we don't know how to, you know, we don't know
Mm.
how to navigate that. And the real reason is because we do not have representation of what vulnerability looks like. You know, vulnerability has never been modeled to us as men, so we
Mm.
don't know, okay, how do I embrace my brother when he's dealing with something,
Mm.
with seeming like there's something wrong with me, or without making it seem awkward? You know, how do I navigate that? And that's,
Mm.
I think that's the major part of why. And I've seen a lot of my brothers struggle, but I know that even for me, with a lot of my close friendships with other brothers, like, I always delve deep into what's going on with you. You know, like, it's more
Mm.
than, you know, congrats on that new position you got. Like, how you dealing with family? How you dealing with the kids? You know, how you dealing with, you
Mm.
know, just, you know, how is your car? Like, you know, are you, you know, like, have you been able to maintain your car? Because if you can't maintain your car, you know, then what does that kind of reflects in other areas of your life? You know, like, asking those deep-seated questions that we all
Yeah.
awkward to ask.
That's so interesting. You've said so many key things there. One around, men not really knowing how to have conversations with other men. And so
Yes.
even when they are speaking to one another, it's so surface level where we don't really go deeper.
Yeah.
And as you were talking, something else I was thinking is, you've nicely explained how the therapy room can be a safe space because it allows room for emotions. But
Yeah.
then it made me think how unintentionally outside of the therapy room, we create unsafe spaces for men to share their emotions. There's just no space to have those kind of conversations because it's just not what we do. We don't,
Yes.
and it goes back again to that point you made about language, how, sometimes we can make those passing comments. But for a man, it's like, okay, this is not a safe space to open up about things.
Yeah.
And I think something else that you said, which was so key, is when we internalize these things, it has to go somewhere. So if we're carrying all these things with us and we don't have safe spaces to share them, then we tend to then look at unhelpful ways of managing with
Yes.
alcohol or drugs or finding other ways to express that. So that, you've made so many key points there. around one, the difficulties with expressing emotions, not even having the spaces to express emotions, and even when you want to, how do you even begin to have that conversation with people who are close to you? I know you've talked about it from men with men, but even men with women,
Yes.
it could also be quite difficult to have those conversations with people that you're close to.
Yes, because and then sometimes that leads to infidelity in a lot of relationships, because even though the man goes ahead and cheats with somebody, the need is still not being met, because what he requires is his wife to actually be direct and be able to be a part of that space for him, where they can have conversation about stuff and he doesn't have to feel judged. And I think look at the relationship dynamic as how there's a lot of pressure for men to conform. If you're not making a certain amount of money, then you do not, you're basically being stripped of your manhood. The
Mm-hmm.
wife might say anything, but then a lot of her actions or behaviors will show.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what happens is that men go out and they find something else that will just numb the pain, but then that pain is just temporary, whether it's cheating on her with somebody else, or going to get into drugs or alcohol, whatever. Like it's still temporary. You still come back to that space that you were in, and now you have to figure out what to do. So it's just a very, very limited coping mechanism that
Yeah.
a lot of times men engage in.
And a question here, if you're happy to answer this now, Chris, is how do we create safe spaces outside of the therapy room for men to feel comfortable to express themselves and talk about
Right.
things that they're going through?
I think a lot of it has to, if it's in the context of relationships, for example, I think it really has a lot to do with more of the open-ended questions. So we're not just asking closed-ended questions like how are you or how's your day. It's more so like in depth. What is going on with you? Like, this is what happened to me. And a lot of it has to do with modeling. Like I said, men don't, because we don't always know how to be vulnerable. Sometimes we need it to be modeled to us. We
Mm.
need it on like how we can do that. So starting a conversation with that in a relationship or even in a friendship is being able to say, man, this is what happened to me. What about you? Kind of throwing
Mm.
it back at, and then before you're engaging in these conversations. I know for me in male friendships, what I found is that, a lot of my brothers, they'll refuse to go to therapy because they're like, you're my therapist. And I'm like, I'm not your therapist. But it's easier for them. And a lot of times they'll say, I don't want to see a therapist because you're already my therapist. And because we're already friends. I'm like, no, that's not how it works. But then for them, what they see as is, I've opened up myself to you in a certain way that I'm not going to do with a stranger. And
Mm.
so because of that, I want to be able to express myself, because I know you've proven to me over time that you can trust me, and so that's the same thing even in our romantic relationships, is where our women are able to say to us that, hey, I'm in a space to listen to you. What is going on with you? How can I support you? Sometimes it's not even about the conversation, it's about the woman's actions.
Mm.
So sometimes it could just be her doing something that might be beneficial for him. It could be sending him a video or a podcast or something that has to do with
Mm.
anything that has to do with masculinity, and then just saying like, what did you think about it? Like, I watched it as well, and this is what I thought. What do you think? And then he engages in these conversations, and then before you know it, the man is actually talking about his own personal stuff.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of consistency. It takes a lot of time, to kind of build up those conversations, but then with that consistency, then you're able to get a lot more out.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
somebody just said here, D-Real said, in our communication, tone of voice, how we affirm them, validate their feelings is how we create a safe space for men. And as you were saying that, Chris, what came to my mind is it's interesting because you're I thought about, in dynamics, a lot of times we come into relationships expecting that the way that we express our emotions, the way we are vulnerable, that our partner can do the same. And so a lot of times when they're not doing the same, we get quite frustrated Like,
Yes.
why can't you just tell me? Why do I have to work this hard to get something out of you? And
Yeah.
unintentionally, we are pushing them away even more. And it starts this whole cycle because, when you were talking about sending a video, asking more in-depth questions, that is being intentional in creating a safe space for them to feel safe as well to express their emotions. But
Yes.
sometimes that doesn't come naturally to a lot of us because we just expect that if we're vulnerable and we're comfortable with being vulnerable, that our partner should be able to do the
Yeah.
same.
Yes, yes, and a lot of times women think automatically it should happen. That's such a great point that you make, because like what Nanda was saying on there as far as like tone of voice, it really has to do with, when you look at that, when that book came out, the Five Love Languages, that book seemed to register more towards women, and so it was just more so of this one-sided thing in relationships where, okay, what is her love language and what are the things that, but then no one was really talking about like what are men's love languages,
Mm.
kind of like what she said, like, how a lot of us as men, we love affirmation, and wherever we get it is where we feel safe,
Mm.
so it's affirming, because the crux of most relationships is that there's a higher expectation for men to reach. And so what happens when we fall short? Does that mean that we don't get that support from you guys? Or does that mean that there's something wrong with us? Or does that mean that, hey, we're going to embrace you regardless? And so when men feel that affirmation, it's very easy to start getting more vulnerable, because now you feel like there's no form of judgment. So I think that we do as men, we also have our own love languages, and tone of voice is a huge part as well, like how
Mm.
the delivery, how the message is being delivered is a huge part of that.
Yeah, so good. So, given what you've shared so far, can we just discuss kind of ways that men can take care of their mental health, or people around them that care for them, how they can support men to take care of their mental health?
Okay. So there's so many different ways, I mean, obviously both of us being, therapists, I think the big, message we always try to push is for more of us to go to therapy. So I would definitely recommend that. I think that, promoting, I think Black clinicians, is a huge representation. And, I always get referrals because it's like, oh, I want, my preference is a Black male therapist or Black female therapist or whatever. So I think us as Black clinicians being more open to a wider spectrum of clientele within our community that we can help is a huge part. But I also think that and within therapy, you're able to model, at least for me, I've been able to model what vulnerability should look like for men. And so when we were able to model that, we're able to also put men in a position where they start to search for spaces where they can get that support system. They start
Mm.
to require that from their wives or their girlfriends. They try to they start to require that from their friendships. They start to be more specific on the kind of friends they hang out with, because a lot of times as men, we do not hold each other accountable. We constantly, you'll have a friend who's cheating on his wife and you just laugh it off. There's no
Mm.
going on with you, and I'm not tolerating this, with you as your brother, as your friend. This is what I require you to do. This is the standard I'm setting for you. I think also, for men to be able to have, even with women, being able to give that empathy, but that accountability at the same time, being able to kind of bring those two things together. I understand what you're going through, but this is what needs to happen. These are the changes that need to happen.
Mm.
Also understanding for men that aggression doesn't have to be the norm for me. I have more in my personality toolbox. I can be goofy,
Mm.
smile, if I'm being too nice, there's nothing wrong with that, or being too kind, also identifying how we objectify women as well, being able to look at what role do we as men play when it comes to how we treat women and how they react to us, or how they react in the workplace, being able to advocate for women in the workplace when they're being, put down, or being able to advocate for women, in the household where it's like, you don't have to do all the dishes. I can engage in domestic duties as well, also for us as men to be able to create self-care for ourselves, and self-care, looks like, being engaging in groups that support other men, being in healthy relationship with other men, looking for mentors, that can mentor us and show us like, okay, older men who have been through some of the past that we've been through and have turned out successfully, spending time grooming, taking care of ourselves, manicure, pedicures. There's nothing wrong with that, guys. I do it. I'm not ashamed. Facials, all that. I'm big on skincare, like so, like that. It's huge, it's huge for us. And then also being able to pour back into our community, so knowing that there's actually a former classmate of ours, Dexter Sullivan, who once said that you cannot be a successful Black man if you haven't poured into another Black boy. And so taking on responsibilities to say, hey, let me mentor other boys, coming along. Let me put something into their lives. Or if I have a son, being able to pour into his life, being able to spend time with him. And my relationship with him shouldn't be based out of, being, critical of him or, affirming our boys, the same way that we want to be affirmed.
Yeah, so many great things there. You talked about modeling. Modeling is something that you've mentioned a number of times on the call today. Modeling vulnerability for men to see that. And I really liked what you said about empathy and accountability and how those two things can go together. You can create a space of empathy, but also hold men accountable. And what you said about, really broadening that emotional repertoire, that there's more underneath that than just aggression. And as you were saying that, it made me think about something I read recently around how, for a lot of men, anger is a secondary emotion. So underneath that emotion, there's anxiety, there's hurt, there's sadness. But the first thing you often see is the anger, and really creating a space where, they can begin to see and experience a wealth of emotions in addition to anger, but not the only one. And self-care being okay. And a lot of what you're saying here is you're really kind of breaking down the wall of those boxes, because sometimes, those man boxes can really confine us and confine what we feel we can or cannot do, and can keep things quite restricted. How do we support a spouse with mental health challenges?
So that's a very broad question. There's so many ways, mental health challenges, and it also depends on how severe it is. But regardless, when men have mental health challenges, it is bound to affect everyone around them. And so I would say that part of it is having those conversations about how, I don't like to use the word normalize, because I feel like social media has used that word so much recently, but like kind of normalizing that whole conversation about mental health, or having that conversation about like, hey, this is how your behaviors are affecting, you know, the dynamic of our relationship or whatever. And then just being that support, sometimes, just being that support, not throwing therapy into people's faces sometimes is a foundation to kind of building up on, okay, now, here's some suggestions that people that I've seen, but also, giving them, a lot of resources and materials, whether it's, like I said, podcasts or stuff to watch, like, hey, just wanted to see what you thought about that, just check it out. Has nothing to do with you, just wanted you to check it out. And I saw it, like, so you're not lying, but then you're using, you're using different angles to kind of get to the.
Yes. And I really like that idea of the podcast and the videos, because it's well removed enough that men have the space to watch it without instantly getting defensive that this is about me, but also enough so that if they do see things they can relate to, they don't kind of feel threatened by it because it's talking about somebody else, not them. I really do like that. There's another one of how do we support a partner who has trust issues and has witnessed physical abuse from his parents. Take note, he doesn't want therapy. That is quite a big question. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I mean, the root of the trust clearly lies outside of the marriage. It started way before the marriage came to place. And so those are some of the hardest situations, because you have to be on board. That person has to be on board, but you can't force their hand to do it. And so the only way you can navigate that is modeling sometimes as a partner, is being able to model what trust looks like, for that person. Sometimes even having the conversations about trust sometimes, creates that, can cause the person to be defensive, the man to be defensive. So you just modeling what trust looks like, you being able to use the opportunities in your relationship to demonstrate how you trust them, sometimes begins that conversation about, okay, why you haven't, I'm not feeling like you trust me, and then having those conversations, and then, just talking about, their, suggestions as far as like therapy as time goes. I think that it's a process. I would definitely say to the woman that don't blame yourself for this, because as you've seen, there is a historical narrative to the behaviors he has at home. That
Yeah.
a lot of that has to do with outside influences at home before he even came into the marriage. So
Yeah.
don't put that weight on yourself. You can't handle it, but then also, as you do that, as you help him, look for your own support systems that can
Yeah.
help navigate that.
Yeah.
Look for people you can be able to talk to about those things that you're dealing with. And then, I think prayer is a key part. If you're someone who is, spiritual, I think prayer is a big part of it. But I think that the actions that we display is huge, to that person. And so how we demonstrate empathy, like I said, and, trust, all those things are the foundation again to get to that point in conversation where we can say, okay, here's some suggestions I have, as for a therapist, what do you think, so that, because a lot of times with men, we always feel like it's an attack. A lot of men,
Mm,
and a lot of times the trauma of dealing with what you've been through is so hard to go through. Therapy is not easy. you
yeah.
know Clinicians, we know that more than anything, that therapy is extremely difficult. And
Yeah.
so, because that you can't force someone's hand to do it immediately, you have to give them that time.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what you said there is such a key thing, that the root of the trust issue is outside of the relationship, because it's so easy to blame oneself for that. How can girlfriends and wives support men? But I think that you've already answered that through your, the talk that we've had already. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
Right. Well, so I think it's affirmations, how we, how women affirm men. I think that it's a huge part, making sure that the man feels, like a king, regardless of what he's going through, regardless of what he has going on out there. But then also holding him accountable when, he starts to do unhealthy behaviors that affect you in the relationship or affect other people. Then that's where the accountability comes in. But that empathy, and being able to show that, let me do more, let me pour more into you, and it's not all about me in that relationship, it's also about you. And I think that those things can be impactful as we go along, but the consistency has to be there, because you will get resistance, especially as, a lot of times, some men, they resist for a long, for a while. But I also want to encourage, like, men who are on here, to also do the work of making sure that you are surrounded by men who actually have substance, and when I say substance, it's talking about men who actually will pour into your life, whether men in your age group or older men. You always want to have that, because that's what builds you up. That's what changes the dynamic in terms of how you respond to stress at work, or how you respond to situations in a relationship. So as men, it is our responsibility as well, that we need to take on, as the men, the man of the house, or as that, patriarch, who is supposed to model certain behaviors. We also have to be in a position to put ourselves out there and seek the right help, and be able to compartmentalize the kind of friendships that we engage in. These are surface level friends, and we act on the surface level, but I also have these deep-seated friends who genuinely care about me. And I say this because I also practice it. It's something where I always push to reach out to some of my bros that I haven't heard from in months, like, hey, how you doing, what's going on with the family, how are the kids, like, tell me what's going on, and we're able to do that with each other. So
Yeah, no, this has been such a great conversation, Chris. Thank you for taking the time out today to do this with us. You've made so many key points, and you've really highlighted how the gender norms that are present is not just something that men internalize, but even women as well. We can internalize that, and even in the way that we relate to men, can maintain those gender norms.
yeah,
And you've talked about how boys are raised, the messages that we might unintentionally give them, that might, become a barrier to seeking help and expressing emotions. And you've also talked about how men handle emotions, and the impact it can have both short term and long term. And you really gave us some practical skills around how to support men with their mental health. And I think you've mentioned over and over about modeling. Modeling is such a key thing that you've talked about today. Affirmations, creating safe spaces outside of the therapy room, where men can feel safe enough to talk and express themselves, but also putting that responsibility back on men as well to seek out safe relationships where they can express themselves in a safe way, as part of that also being helpful in helping maintain their mental health. So thank you so much for that. Do you have any kind of last words or comments before we end the call or the live?
I think that at the end of the day, it's all about us, you know, holding each other accountable, right? And for men and for boys, creating that safe space, whether it's in the classroom, parent-teacher conference with your teachers, you know, talking with your kids, like, hey, how is my child reacting in the classroom? You know, doing all that, you know, but helping each other.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. And thanks to everyone for joining in and being a part of this.
Debbie, it's an honor. Thank you so much. And you're a phenomenal clinician, you know, so I definitely love all the work that you're putting in. And so I'm grateful for this platform.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye. Again.